Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts. Hi, Kate here with a quick update before we hop into this episode. So this episode is part 2 of the sort of Sacredness series. When I recorded about a month ago before the Sacredness part 1 came out in March, I thought this was all going to be one episode and ended up feeling like it wanted to be 2, but I did record them back to back. So the episode that you're about to hear was recorded a month ago from when you're going to be listening to it now, or from when it's going to become available now. And similarly to part 1, this is going to be a little bit of an experiment with me kind of cutting in to maybe make some updates. This is what you'll hear is a very raw, wondering time, kind of me pulling some pieces together. You'll hear me speak to that in the episode. And so there's pauses, there's some channeling, there's some things that come out of my mouth that surprise me. And there's also something, I was really working through something by recording out loud. And then in sitting with it later, I'm in the place in my journey where I'm noticing I'm learning more about layers of healthy gatekeeping and discernment and boundary setting and sort of what is the level of relationship that wants and actually needs to be had for the level of tenderness and the vulnerability that's going to be there. I think in this world of authenticity all the time, we tend to think that means we're supposed to share everything all the time with anyone. And that's actually not true. It's not great for our nervous systems. It also isn't great for relationship. And it isn't great for honoring sacredness and tenderness. So with that said, much like Sacredness Part 1 episode, you might hear parts that are cut out or updated or, it might be a little more edited in some ways than what you're used to, although also really raw in other ways. Raw in terms of sort of just the wonderingness of it all. So thank you for being along with me on that journey. And I hope that the process of it offers you something as well as the content of it. It's not required to have listened to part 1, but you will hear me make some references in this one to things that I spoke to in part 1. And so those might make a little more sense if you have listened to part 1. I think that's about it. And so I'll go ahead and hop into the episode. Thanks for being along with me on the journey. Hi, welcome back to Wild Sacred Journey podcast. You're with your host, me, Kate Powell. So I'd started recording. I was recording an episode on sacredness, and I'd had this whole other section that I had thought I was going to speak to, and then was feeling called to actually let that be its own separate episode. So I am recording it. I'm recording again now right after I just finished recording the other one. So if you're watching this, you'll notice I'm wearing the same clothes. But more importantly, actually, the candle is still lit. Our village fire is still lit here. And that feels right and proper for some sort of strange, non-logical reason. I don't necessarily mean strange. I just mean like if I were getting dogmatic about how I run things, I would say, oh, this is wrong. I should blow it out and light it again. But there's something that's saying, no, just leave it. So I invite you to just gather around the fire that's already here. There's sort of a part 2, maybe another deepening and in some ways more vulnerable for me, perhaps, piece of this conversation around sacredness and around ceremony. So just take a few deep breaths in and out. Ooh. So I'm noticing my heart beating a little bit faster. I think that's just because, yeah, of some of what I'm anticipating sharing. So another sort of aspect of this conversation around sacredness and ceremony. So I was in a yoga class. I guess, gosh, that would have been last year at some point. And it was at a studio that, does a lot of sort of the mindset stuff, some of the spirituality, but also mostly kind of the asana. There was a lot of the physical, a lot of focus on physical postures. And then, kind of with spirituality, new agey spirituality sprinkled in, some of which was better than others, in my opinion. And by that, I mean just more helpful or more grounded or more clearer or cleaner in the sense of being filtered less through wounded egoic selves or internalized empire and colonization selves. What I'm getting at here is integrity and coherence from the sense of like, is what I'm saying aligned on every level with how I'm being? And in spaces where there's a lot of dissonance, I tend to pick up on that, and it feels really uncomfortable for me and for many other people as well, even though they might not always be able to pinpoint it. But that's really what I'm looking at here. So it's not inherently a value judgment, but it's a noticing of whether there's full integrity or not. And, nobody's perfect at that, but that for me feels like an important piece of what we aim for in these moments, particularly when we're speaking to sacredness and ceremony. Now back to the original episode. It's really, I think that's a piece of this conversation, right? Is along with sort of that sense that even when we recognize something as sacred, there's like another step actually to being able to hold that and be a clear channel for that to come through us on behalf of other people. And not to say that we're going to be perfect at that, anybody's going to be perfect at that all the time. But there's, I think there's a quality that we need to look for in our guides, and in the people we choose to work with. I don't know if need's the right word. Well, maybe. But there's a lot of people peddling a lot that sounds really good. And that is also true to a certain extent. But are they carrying that presence and that deep listening? Have they been with their own shadow? Have they walked through ceremony and allowed themselves to not just mentally understand sacred, or even to kind of feel sacred in their body in certain moments, but to actually let themselves become a vessel for sacred, if they're someone who is taking on a role of being a transmitter for that healing presence or that ceremonial transformative presence, right? Otherwise, it's just platitudes. And again, not that platitudes are inherently wrong, right? There are plenty of people who have huge aha moments and awakenings from reading a meme, right? But the aha moment is just one step. And then, you'll often hear me talk about integration. Integration is how we take an aha moment, something that's happened at the level of the mind or of the conscious awareness, that direct gaze flame that I talked about, if you listen to part 1 of this episode. It's how we take that and then bring it deeper into our body, or how we take the shadows on the walls and actually start to question the illusions and start to look further for the reality, right? So anyway, this um, human facilitating this yoga class kept repeating over and over again, many times throughout the class, encouraging students, be your own healer, be your own guru, be your own shaman. And this person kept repeating that over and over and over again. And that sounds, again, very noble. And given that there's a lot in our modern day medical system that encourages us to give our power, our autonomy, our discernment away to quote unquote experts, right? People who are experts, I shouldn't put quotes around that, people who are experts in their specific field, right? But are not experts on our body or our experience, actually. Yeah. So there's something that I think invites a certain level of healing in by saying, be your own healer, in the sense that, yes, I suspect what this person was trying to point to was this abdicating our autonomy, abdicating our own responsibility to be aware of our bodies and what's happening within them, and our responsibility to actually make changes. If we have mindsets and thought patterns we don't like, we get to choose to change them. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it is actually possible. We have brains. Neuroplasticity is a thing. Our brains can be changed, right? Diagnoses would tell us that, nope, we are exactly who and what we are all the time. And again, diagnoses get tricky because there may be an element that they're pointing to that is innate to who we are, that is being diagnosed because it doesn't fit in some way to society. And so it's being treated as a problem. There's also a lot of elements to diagnoses that are actually conditioned responses. And by conditioned, I mean either socially conditioned or conditioned in the sense of like we've created them in response to certain situations, traumas, wounds, ruptures, experiences, and we've put them in place to help us survive and do our best to even come close to thriving. And then we've just left them there. And so they've become a habitual pattern that then is diagnosed, right? But when you look around us at the world, change happens all the time, everywhere, right? We are constantly being invited into transformative and transmutational portals every day, every moment of every day. They say every 7 years, all the cells of our bodies like renew, right? So it's like we're like literally a different person. So while yes, there's certain aspects of us that are going to be through threads, and that's a good thing, and also a challenging thing perhaps, but there's a lot that can be changed. So I suspect what this person is pointing to is partly, yes, this an invitation for people to not give their power away. Where what this person was saying struck me as being short-sighted is this sense of like that we can be our own anything all the time, right? Like we're wired for connection, we are wired for community, and we have blind spots, right? We need community, elders, leaders, support people, right? To help mirror things to us that we can't see within ourselves. That is literally what relationships are meant to do. That is what attunement is. That is what mirroring is, right? Now, whether they're doing it on behalf of power, their own or a system's power, or whether they're doing that on behalf of something more sacred and soulful, that's a big question we need to be asking ourselves. But the fact that we think we can somehow exist in a vacuum and heal and be whole in a vacuum is short-sighted and false. It also cheapens what those roles actually mean and are, in my opinion. So a guru is, well, I don't know if I should speak to that because I don't know that I actually have the cultural understanding to really state what a guru actually is, because what that word specifically, that word is not an English word. And the myriad of meanings that underlay that word and are woven into that word, I suspect I only have the smallest fraction of understanding of what that is. And the same honestly kind of goes for shaman. So shamans, that's another word that kind of gets thrown around a lot because anthropologists just started applying that term to every indigenous wisdom tradition, quote unquote, healer, medicine person, whatever we want to call it, ceremonialist, whatever we want to call it, around the world, even though the only people who actually call themselves shamans are in more Russia and Eastern Europe and kind of that area of the world. I've actually read it as Siberia. I think I thought I said that in the moment, and listening back, I clearly didn't. So adding that in now, back to the episode. So I guess I should frame it up and sort of step back and speak more broadly, because as I said, I can't speak to exactly what those words mean culturally, because they are not from my culture and my native tongue, the tongue I grew up speaking. But I think that kind of points to something right there, right? So if we don't have the language for what those words mean, what those words are trying to point to, if we don't have language for that in our own language, then that's part of why we have trouble actually understanding what that is, understanding what that means, and relating to it in a good way. So we take these terms that we don't have context for from these other languages that aren't ours, you know, that didn't come from the ground. Like language is connected to land. It developed alongside a specific place, experience, context, ecosystem, right? So if our language doesn't have words for these, then yes, we're going to struggle more. And then our attempts are going to be kind of clumsy because we'll end up having to kind of take words from other languages and other lands and other places, which gets messy. So, but to step back more broadly, those specific roles, they are roles within a village, within a society, within a group of people. And mostly they point to people who, for whatever reason, usually some sort of deeper calling. And I don't mean calling in sort of this Western sense of like the things we produce and do, but calling in the sense of like their medicine, right? So their particular gifts and wounds and circumstances come together in whatever little cauldron inside them to alchemically mix together to become something that will serve in a certain way. And then if they had elders and masters that they could apprentice to and things like that, that would be part of that alchemical process. But so they were people who walked between the worlds of that direct flame gaze, right? The material, tangible reality, and what in the Celtic world would be called the other world, right? Or these other planes of existence, these other ways of knowing that we have, this more subtle world, as well as then the physical, tangible world. And so
because of that, they were then the people who could help with the initiations, who could help with these thresholds, these portals, these ceremonial spaces, because they are the conduit for this transformative mystery to move through to help bridge basically between the mystery and what's happening in the human realm.
Hopping in here again to say, there's also a lot of different avenues and roles in society. So there would have been a lot of different shades of grades. There would have been more specialists, more differentiation too between different types of medicine people. People who healed through story, people who healed through touch, people who healed through, and supported ceremony, healed and supported initiation and ceremony. So people who did that in all of these different ways. And there would have been words and names and roles for each of those things. It wouldn't have all been lumped together as one. And so each person would have been able to sort of find their place based on their calling, their medicine, And this is an idealized, in some ways perhaps, idea. But this is, I think, some of what, by kind of erasing and lumping together, we've lost some of that nuance. And so this is some of where I think we have to start untangling that, because then there's a lot of confusion of like, oh, well, if I teach yoga and have studied Reiki and whatever, I'm a shaman, and it's like, not necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily. So there's a lot of this kind of confusion that we have right now that makes the discernment process of what approach or modality might actually serve us as a person seeking support, and also then in the discernment of who we're working with, and what their approach might be. We need more diversity, more nuance, more complexity there, rather than sort of this oversimplification. Back to the episode.
So to say be your own of that actually cheapens the importance of those roles in society when it comes to things like honoring what's sacred, when it comes to things like helping humans initiate into being humans, right? When it comes to healing and repair work after rupture. So that's not actually something that just anybody can or should be. We all speak the language of energy in our own ways and to our own extents, and we should. I definitely, I feel it's a heartbreaking travesty that we have been taught to fear our ability to speak the language of energy, and thus to forget how to speak the language of energy. So we should absolutely bring that back, because every human's birthright is to be instinctive and intuitional, instinctual and intuitional.
I believe the word I was looking for here was intuitive, but that's fine. We'll let that go. Back to the episode.
Right? Animal and soulful. And speaking the language of energy helps us do both, because our nervous system operates at the language of energy. Relationship happens at the language of energy as well, at the level of energy, as well as other things. So we absolutely should do that. To be a quote unquote shaman, that's the baseline requirement for that. But there's a whole other, the ability to actually facilitate ceremony and the bridging of worlds. Again, all humans have that to a certain extent, but to be able to do that within a society and for other humans is something a little deeper. So I was not planning on speaking about all of this. And here we go. Um, I'm like just being the mouthpiece right now. So there's all kinds of things coming out. So I'm just going to sit with this for a moment, and I invite you to just kind of sit with what I shared, because there was a couple things that came through that even I was a little surprised about. Um, that whole realization about language and not having terms for medicine people, and then like, of course, we don't have the brain, the neural wiring then to even understand what that is. I was like, oh, of course. But anyway, I was not. I don't know that I would have been able to name that before this episode, and it just coming out of my mouth right now. Yeah. Okay. Just listening in for where the bridge is between what I was just speaking about and what I actually thought I was going to be speaking about. So part of like ceremony, like I sort of mentioned in part one of this, and you'll probably hear me say again if you stick around for a while, ceremony is not comfortable. Like a lot of these things have kind of taken on this sheen of glamour, I would say, maybe right now in this day and age. Partly because of social media, partly because our own internalized like consumerism and um like exploitation kind of has us sort of like taking things that defy that and trying to like rein them in and put them back into a box. So like spirituality is good if it involves buying lots of crystals, right? And I have plenty, so I'm not judging, but just pointing out um yeah, where it's we see the world through lenses, right? And until we've questioned the lenses that we're seeing the world through, we will continue to see a world made in our image. And so if the culture that we've been, the waters that we swim in, which is then the image that we, which informs how we're seeing the world, is sort of superficial, consumerist driven, more about appearance and youth and this perceived vitality rather than and life and all of that kind of stuff, then that's the kind of sheen or glamour we're going to overlay onto these traditions and processes that are actually just as evocative of death and endings and discomfort and defy consumerism and materialism and um, are going to change us and mature us and age us, right? Um, and so, so I think some of the struggle too, when we kind of get into this be your own guru, be your own shaman, be your own, whatever, is that if we say that again without inquiring into what those roles were before we started seeing the world as we see it now, then again, we remake those roles into our own image and they lose their potency. Right. And so many of those roles were also people who lived on the edges of society because the spaces they facilitated were inherently uncomfortable. Right. And the point of evolution through ceremony is that it it takes us, it creates something new that's maybe never been made before. So, yes. So, the people who held the role in the society of facilitating that level of evolution, of creating something new, had to sort of be a little bit outside of that water that most people are kind of swimming in. Otherwise, they risk not being able to see as clearly or to be as clear channels. And so that's, I think, some of where, too, we do ourselves a disservice when we also write off the elders, the differently abled, the um, people who walk between genders, people who walk between clear definitions of sexuality, right? People who exist in sort of these in between spaces that challenge our comfort and our ideas of what's quote unquote normal, right? You know, they remind us what it is to be messy and mortal, too, a lot of that. You know, our brains don't do so well with mess. They want things to be ordered, they want things to be comfortable.
Hopping in here because in the next section of this episode, I'm sharing about a diagnosis I received 8 years ago and haven't shared a whole lot about because I've been really a big part of the process for me. Yes, there's been the grief and whatever around it, and certainly a lot of grappling with my own internalized ableism, and all of that, and the rawness and the vulnerability of all of that, and what it means for my life, and and that's all been way too tender to kind of speak to. But there's also, I do truly believe that there's a certain amount of what we speak becomes reality. And so even what I do share, you won't hear me go into too much detail about it because I'm sort of trying to tread a little lightly, not speak it too heavily into existence, while also still acknowledging that I think too that there can be a certain amount of ableism that can start to kind of color some of the rhetoric that we have around, oh, don't speak it into existence. We can manifest a different reality. We can, heal it all. Nothing is set, because while I do believe that's true, again, here's this lens coming through that we have that somehow when something is quote unquote not ideal or quote unquote not optimal, or our body quote unquote fails us in some way, that it's like there's this undertone of that it's this moralistic failure on our part, or we aren't quote unquote evolved enough, or we haven't we don't believe in the light enough, or whatever that may be, because there's this idea that our bodies are supposed to be functioning, and if our bodies are not functioning at a certain level, then there's something that's gone wrong, there's something that's failed. So you'll hear me in this next section kind of walking this tricky edge of honoring what seems to be true for my physical reality, honoring the lessons of that space, which are gifts, even though they may not be very comfortable ones, and also trying to honor that it's possible, that miracles are possible, and they actually happen all the time, and that we have to, I think a big part of this process is listening into which is actually meant to be my path here. For some people, it's meant to be almost this miraculous healing because that's what their soul needs for some sort of evolution, or, within themselves, within the greater field of love, within the people that they're in contact with, and then for some people, they're meant to succumb to whatever physical change is happening, whether it's a death, whether it's a different ability, whatever it might be. And that, we shouldn't rob those moments of their beauty, even in their tragedy, and their gift just because it wasn't quote unquote ideal or wasn't quote unquote optimal or they weren't quote unquote cured, because it may be that that's actually what needed to happen for some sort of soul evolution, for some sort of evolution of love. So I just wanted to name that because, that's definitely present in a lot of what I'm thinking and feeling and grappling with. And in listening back, I'm not sure how clearly sort of those elements came through of honoring what's true in the physical without needing to bypass it or run or avoid it. Also honoring the truth that sometimes when we receive a diagnosis and we believe it too deeply, it becomes true. And if we sort of don't lean so heavily on it and don't put so much weight on it, something else becomes possible, or at least a different level of relationship with whatever is happening becomes possible. And then also, honoring that there can be this sort of ableist toxicity, this sort of spiritual bypassy judgment of our bodies when they do turn out to be human and mortal and messy and fragile and all of these other things that also isn't helpful. So just naming that as a container to kind of hold this next piece in, and for you to maybe then even kind of notice where you'll hear me, maybe not all the words or the tone of all the words will completely live up to what I'm saying now, because when I recorded this, a lot of grief was still activated. A lot of my own internalized ableism and judgments, like I said, was still activated. So, so there's some context for that if you hear that in my tone. Back to the episode.
I've been sitting recently a lot with the question of how long form grief and diagnoses that have no quote unquote cure, no ideal outcome, right? And I use that term loosely and sort of with this modern mindset. I've been sitting a lot with how those can help us, how those are ceremony themselves, how those can help us actually find sacred and move into these spaces of being more human by being initiated into it, right? And so about 8 years ago, I found out that I have the same. Some of you may have heard me sort of mention this before, but I haven't spoken about it for a lot of different reasons until now. But there's something about now that feels right. So I have the same genetic degenerative eye disease that my dad has. And a couple of weeks ago from when I'm recording this, I went back for my first eye appointment to get that checked out. And that stirred up a lot of stuff. So I think that's part of why it's kind of with me right now. And then, I've been sitting recently too with a friend. I was in conversation not too long ago with a friend who has a diagnosis of a fairly untreatable form of cancer. I heard a story recently of a family whose child got a pretty early terminal diagnosis and ultimately did end up passing. So there's lots of these stories that have kind of been coming up recently for me. And I've been paying attention to them in part because I think there's something about this space of, and this is where it sort of bridges back to what I was sharing about the people who exist at the kind of the edges of society, in the margins, the ones who are maybe a little messier than our minds would mostly like to be comfortable with, but who ultimately can offer us some sort of insight into being human, because I think it's in these moments when we receive some sort of life-altering news that we really have to sit with the question of what matters most. What does it mean to have a good life? And that's really when we have to step outside this idea of like, that it matters what we produce, right? Because part of why our society has no time for the elderly and the disabled or the differently abled or the handicapped or whatever we want to call them, right? Like, whether that's mental or physical or emotional or whatever, part of the reason our society has very little patience for them is that most of those people exist outside of production. And so if our value, our worth isn't because of production, then what is it? And I'm still very much in this inquiry. I'm still very much in sort of an unlearning um, process around all of this, as well as, I mean, just an ongoing grief. Like, how do we live with grief? You know, grief and gratitude, right? In every moment. And there's fear and there's, you know, there's bypassing and there's all of that. But it's like when we drop underneath the stories of all of that, there's this silence and this witnessing presence. And there's something beyond words that feels deeply sacred and also somehow closer to what it means to be human than maybe anything else could bring us to. Because ultimately, although we can go through many small ceremonies along the way, it almost seems to me like birth and death are the beginning and ends of a portal that we're moving through. That's one long ceremony, one long initiation, one long stepping into it and somehow being changed and torn apart and knit back together again, like again and again and again, in ways that then on the other side of that, we have no idea what we become. And so that's where, for me, it feels like it's so important to have some sense of the sacred or to have some sense of faith. Because otherwise, that's just fucking terrifying. And it can still be that, even with the sense of sacred, even with the sense of faith. But it's somehow like we need to have these balancing, opposing forces. Otherwise, I don't know, I think I'd just lose it. And I suspect from these other conversations that I've had with people, I don't think I'm alone in that. You know? So I think an important piece of this being human and being with the sacred is then pausing in our impulse to jump right to fighting it or to affirming life, right? And all of that stuff, because while grieving can be done without affirming life, I think it's also one of the most life affirming things we can actually do. And it's, I think, one of the most human things we can do. And so maybe too, I'm realizing as I'm speaking that it's not just about diagnoses, it might also be about activism, which isn't to say, like, this is not to say we need to just navel gaze and not do things, right? Because sacred being with the sacred being in ceremony is not actually navel gazing. Navel gazing keeps things at the level of awareness, at the level of conscious mind, at the level of mental processes.
Navel gazing also keeps us at the level of the individual too, rather than the collective, which ceremony is more, even when we're working it individually, it's with the understanding that it's on behalf of the evolution of the collective as well as the individual.
And ceremony happens on deeper and wider levels than that. So if we let these, whatever is uncomfortable in our lives, whatever feels unfixable in our lives, whatever brings us to the boundaries of our own capacities, limitations, mortalities, finiteness, if we let whatever brings us there, then show us more of what it is to be human, something starts to happen in that process. And I think that might be the point of being here. Yeah, I think that might be the point of being here. And I'm not the first person to say this. But this is just my embodied, my embodiment of these things that could be platitudes unless we bring them in and hold them as sacred and let them change us. So yeah, that feels complete for now. So thank you for gathering with me around the fire for this moment. Thank you for the witnessing as I am trusting as I'm recording this. I mean, I can feel how even as I'm recording this, even if, I'm recording this by myself, but I can feel already at the level of energy, time and space aren't linear. And I can feel the witnessing that will happen when I release this podcast out into the world by those of you who do tune in. And so I just acknowledge what it is to be a witness for something like this, what it is to show up tenderly. Yeah. Okay. I'll add too. Yeah. So the other night I was talking to my parents some and part of, I think what's been actually the most quote unquote traumatic aspects of receiving this diagnosis has actually been in my dealings with the medical professionals who have been very kind, but there's something about the dehumanization that happens a lot. I think for them to be able to get through their days and get through their work, but then also because I think many of them get into it because they're interested in a specific aspect of being human rather than the totality of it. So they're interested in the disease and the physical pieces of it. And when they speak to me, it often feels like they've forgotten that there's a whole human attached to these eyes that they're looking at. And so while they're calmly delivering, whatever aspect of the news they have to deliver, I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, I'm like my mind spiraling, figuring out like all the ways that I have to like might have to revamp my entire life and blah 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 blah, right? Like that's where my brain goes, right? And there's very little container for my humanity. Um and the whole human, and because the other piece of this too is as we're changed, that ripples out, and that's going to change things for the people in our lives, right? The people who care about us, the people who might end up caretaking us, the um all of that. So so I was talking to my parents and they were like, well, my dad, he has the disease. Like I said, I inherited it from him. And he's spent a lot of his life doing a lot of advocacy work, uh, in a lot of most ways, I think I would say kind of on the political lobbying kind of level. Because there's a lot of ways blind people and people with invisible disabilities really fall through the cracks. And there's a lot of things that we could do that would be relatively simple changes that would make a big difference for people with visual impairments and blindness. But anyway, so one of the things he often sees a lot for people who have just lost their eyesight, whether suddenly or gradually, whether young or old, is that there isn't a whole lot of counseling. There isn't a lot of the mental health aspect of this, and doctors are getting a little better at referring people to um, resources to help them kind of process the news. But that's still not great. And so they were kind of asking me like, you know, do you feel like that's something that's missing? They were sort of asking me like, what would have helped you feel better after that appointment? What would you have wanted? And and I think as I've been sitting with kind of this question, I think some of it is this idea of ceremony, that actually I think part of the grief is not just around the diagnosis and how that may or may not change my life, because you know that that part is pretty much entirely in the mystery's hands. The great mystery. But ceremony itself honors and acknowledges the change that's always happening, the wisdom and eldering process that can unfold for us, if we make space for it.
It's also where we are witnessed, and witnessing, feeling truly witnessed is such a profound comfort and such an important alchemical ingredient in the process of moving through initiation.
And it's also a way of our community then either coming together around us to say, like, we've got you, or honoring that they too will be changed by a diagnosis in some way, that having someone who is now existing a little more in that in-between space, that actually is a gift. There's something that they've been drawn closer to, that they can now bridge the space between. And that's the part that I think we miss in a lot of spaces. And it would be overly simple to call it a celebration. And it would be overly simple to call it some sort of funeral or releasing ceremony. I think, we can be too quick to want to release the things that are uncomfortable. And that's where I think just ceremony works, because it is beautiful and heartbreaking and sacred and very mortal and messy. And also, I think just why we're here, like I said. So, okay. Yeah. So that feels like enough for today. So you're welcome. I'm not looking for any platitudes in response to this. If this conversation made you uncomfortable, I invite you to sit with that uh, before sharing any thoughts with me, because some of your discomfort might be more about you than it is about me or your own relationship to what I've been sharing. I do, however, still welcome conversation and hearing any of your thoughts or musings that this provoked, and um, hearing if this changed or shifted anything for you, any insights. Yeah, that this opened for you. And so with that, I say thanks again for joining me around this fire and for letting this real-time wondering happen. And I will see you next time. Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts in humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1, share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2, join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement-free so the conversations stay intact as they are. If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, from my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.